jobs, and yet we rent a house here in Santa Barbara. Along, not just me, but Olivia Marr, another Coastal Housing Coalition board member, helped get this session together. Olivia's with Vinac, Faber, Archibald, and Spray, and she's going to be doing the moderating this afternoon as I kick back and get the wine reception ready. But again, we appreciate your attendance, appreciate those of you who sponsored the event. I do want to say once more, we did find a wallet from a gentleman named Tony. I'm not sure who's claimed it yet, but it's with Craig Minus or Shannon. So if anyone named Tony is missing a wallet, we have it for you. So we are here, our session A, Making Housing a Priority, Act or React. And we have a great panel we've assembled here, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about them. Immediately here is Chris Lee. Chris came down from Sacramento. He's a legislative analyst with the California State Association of Counties for the Housing, Land Use, and Transportation Policy Committee. He joined CSAC in 2013. Before that, he worked for the County of Yolo for 5 years, worked with their County Administrator's Office, focusing on state legislation, intergovernmental regulations, with the county, cities, and a federally recognized tribe. Prior to that, Chris was with 82 county supervisors, the first representing an expansive rural ag district and the second an urban district with a major research university. Sounds a bit familiar. Chris is from Mississippi, which I did not know. He's a native of Mississippi. He's lived in California since childhood, has a bachelor's in economics and poli-sci from UC Davis. Next to Chris is Alan Bell. He's been with Santa Barbara County Planning since 2005 as a senior planner in development review. Well, he was with development review process permit applications for a variety of housing projects. In 2012, he was promoted to supervising planner in long-range planning, where his team prepared the 2015-2023 county housing element. They recently developed incentives and programs for senior, affordable, special needs, and transitional and supportive housing. Before joining the county, Alan worked for the Columbia River Gorge Commission, a bi-state planning agency responsible for planning of the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. Next to Alan is Renee Brooke, who has 18 years of experience with land use planning, 16 years with the city of Santa Barbara. She's now the city planner. She currently manages a group of 32 diverse planners in 4 sections, 32. Long-range planning, she manages those planners in 4 sections. Long-range planning and special studies, design review and historic preservation, development and environmental review, and zoning and enforcement. That sounds like a lot. Ms. Brooke also has an experience as a project manager with the city's former redevelopment agency as a coastal program analyst for the Coastal Commission. She has a bachelor's of science in city and regional planning from Cal Poly in West Love. I'm just going to make a couple comments and then hand it off to Chris here. Preparing for this session, noted a study that was put out by HCE, you can get at their website, called California's Housing Future, Challenges and Opportunities. It's a statewide housing assessment for 2025. A couple of facts from that. Based on projected population and household growth, they're indicating that the state needs 1.8 million new houses by 2025. And that's 180,000 new homes annually statewide. We are producing an average of less than 80,000 new homes annually over the last 10 years. We're continuing to fall below that projected need. Just to cherry pick a couple of the challenges identified in that study related to housing affordability. Housing supply continues to not keep pace with demand, and the existing system of land use planning and regulation creates barriers to development. The report also offers opinions about options for addressing housing challenges, including reform reacting and acting, and what the impacts are of that top-down approach. Our goal of this session is to provide an overview of recent state legislation, current and pending bills that are intended to prioritize housing and increase the supply. Then we're going to talk about the status of county and city implementation of the ADU mandate and some of the reaction to that and the anticipated impacts. The county has actually started a public hearing and workshop process to develop their ADU ordinances. They've got a good start in Montecito, which certainly may be a bit of an outlier, but they're going to the County Planning Commission coming up on June 7th to talk about the implementation of the program. Again, in reaction to the state handing down this ADU mandate, the city has taken some proactive action with the AUD program, the Average Unit Density Program. We'll talk about the status of that program and the city meeting its housing needs with or without it. And then we'll wrap it up and get some Q&A on whether ADU and AUD are just the start and the impacts and trade-offs of prioritizing housing and reacting to a top-down approach. With that said, I'm going to hand off to Chris, and I'm going to do a little PowerPoint shuffle here, but this is Chris Lee. Thanks.
Hey, good morning. I'm Chris Lee with the California State Association of Counties, and while Steve pulls up my slides, I'll give you just a little bit of overview of what CSAC is. So we are basically the trade association for county supervisors in California. A lot of people are familiar with the League of Cities. We're basically the equivalent of that group for county government. So we've been around since 1895. We're a voluntary association, and we have all 58 counties as members of our group. So let's see if I'm on my outfit. There we go. I'm going to cover today a few things. I'm going to try to distill down into just 10 or 15 minutes the state of the debate that's going on statewide and especially in our legislature related to California's housing crisis. What's it caused by, and what are the solutions that the state can enact to address it? So I'm going to start with a recap of the 2015-16 legislative session. Again, trying to keep it at broad strokes. And what was sort of widely viewed as a missed opportunity for housing. So while we did have some significant bills, a couple of which we're going to talk about how our local governments here in Santa Barbara are going to implement them, there really wasn't major policy shifts made at the state level last year. That's really ratcheted up the pressure because, as everyone knows, the housing market hasn't changed drastically. We're still in this perceived, and I would argue, real crisis of affordability. And so the legislature has responded with an even broader suite of legislative proposals this year. And finally, we are sort of at at least for the 2017 legislative year, at kind of a major turning point in the legislative session that I think is going to really shape the debate in the coming months. So Steve did a good job at giving an overview of some of the numbers. I really think that there's lots of different ways to slice this, but there's pretty much a consensus statewide now that we are in something that would appear to be a crisis situation. So the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is the legislature's nonpartisan fiscal analyst and pretty widely respected as a neutral arbiter of analysis and facts, put out a pretty broad report a couple of years ago. And some of the key findings from that report are that while California has always been a little bit more expensive than other states, that's really been growing over the last several decades. So in 1970, the average home price in California was about 30% higher than the nationwide average, and only 10 years later, in 1980, it was 80% higher. Flash forward a few more decades, and we're now in a situation where the average home in California costs $440,000, and I think this number might be a little stale now, actually, which is 2.5 times above the national average. That also applies to our rental housing stock, where we have average monthly rent, and I believe this is for probably a one-bedroom unit, you can double-check that, for $1,240 a month, just 50% higher than the national average. So another way of slicing the data, California Forward's an advocacy group that has a housing challenge area where they're really pushing for comprehensive solutions. And they had a pretty exhaustive analysis done by a consulting firm that really echoes the numbers that Steve mentioned from HCD. So They feel that currently statewide we have a shortage of about 2 million housing units. Over the next several years, up to 2025, there's going to be new demand from population growth for 1.5 million units, and only about 1 million units that were projected to be built over that time if we continue building at our current rate. So they're identifying a 2.5 million unit gap to fill by 2025. And that's the HCD number. So pointing out the 100,000 unit a year shortage for development of housing in California. So the 2015 legislative session was, I've been at CSAC, I think, 3 legislative sessions now. And from our perspective, this was a massive flood of housing legislation. And little did we know what was going to happen in 2017. But in any case, there were several significant pieces of legislation introduced that year. And I'm going to talk first about the funding-related proposals. So really, the focus of these is subsidizing housing that's not going to be constructed without government assistance, so the below-market rate housing. And ever since the loss of redevelopment agencies several years ago, which were required to apportion about 1/5 of their tax increment revenue to support affordable housing in the redevelopment areas, there's been an ongoing debate at the Capitol about finding a funding source to replace that, and that's in our parlance, we talk about the permanent source. So the major bill that was introduced in the 15-16 session on that topic was Assemblywoman, now Senator Atkins' AB 1335, which is a real estate recording fee that was going to be imposed on documents filed at your county clerk recorder's office, with the exception of actually some documents related to the purchase of homes, which was a concession demanded by the California realtors. That bill failed in the Assembly. There was a bill by Assemblymember Chu, which was going to increase by $300 million a year the state's tax credits, which would allow us to draw down additional federal low-income housing tax credits. That bill got through both houses of the legislature, but was vetoed by the governor. And we'll get into reasons why the governor took that action in a second. One successful element from the 15-16 session was the Senate's No Place Like Home initiative. So what that did was it took from this millionaire's tax from the mental health services account, which was passed, I think, in 2010 or so, but a surtax of 1% on incomes over $1 million a year. And they're going to use that revenue to purchase $2 billion in bonds to subsidize and construct permanent supportive housing, which is really aimed at people with, obviously, they have to have a co-occurring mental health condition, given the funding source that we're talking about here. But that's probably the most significant piece of housing funding legislation that was successful last year. And again, this is targeted, obviously, at usually extremely low-income people who are chronically homeless. It's not really getting at the broader problem that we find ourselves in, where people in the middle class and even at the high ends of that are experiencing affordability issues. Finally, the Assembly Democratic Caucus had a proposal where they wanted about $1.2 billion in general funding from the state in order to support multifamily housing and a variety of programs. And that sort of became the crux of the debate between the Assembly and the governor. So when the governor issued his May revised budget in 2016, he included a proposal which has become known as the governor's buy right proposal. So the concept for this proposal was that when a housing project in a jurisdiction is proposed and it meets the so-called objective standards, which is sounds very clear, but in practice we're not entirely sure what that always means. But the idea was that if it's consistent with the zoning and setbacks, intensity, and all the other local requirements, that it should be approved through a ministerial process, so without a discretionary review. And the governor wanted this to apply not just to subsidized housing, to the very low income housing, wanted it to apply broadly to market rate housing. And there were some criteria in terms of the sites where these projects would have to be located. So projects that were in the coastal zone, were excluded from this treatment. There's a few other considerations like that. And there were also some concessions that the developers would have to take. So they would have to provide a certain percentage of affordable units in a market rate project in order to qualify for the streamlining. So the governor put in play, along with this streamlining proposal, $400 million in one-time general fund spending to support subsidized housing. And so his argument was that before we add any funding for subsidy, we have to streamline the process because the entitlement process and the local rules and the CEQA lawsuits and everything else are driving up the cost of housing and keeping the supply from coming online. Well, as everyone knows, the legislature had a pretty limited appetite for taking this up. And a few key reasons are you had environmental interest groups who were worried about what appeared to be a de facto CEQA exemption for projects that they thought could have significant impacts on the environment. You had organized labor groups who are clear that sometimes they are able to use challenges during the discretionary land use approval process in order to get concessions from developers in terms of project labor agreements or other things. So not to mention local government, CSAC had a supportive amended position. We thought the sites where this would apply was a little bit too broad, but the League of Cities was pretty strongly opposed to the concept of the state coming in and saying we're going to impose a non-discretionary process for land use approvals on local government. So given really opposition from all those key constituencies, the legislature didn't actually formally take up the proposal, and it died, and the $400 million set aside from the governor's budget went away. So those were really the major things. So with the exception of No Place Like Home, we didn't really provide any subsidy for low, very low, affordable homes. The streamlining proposals really, sputtered out. But there were a few successful bills, and we're going to talk about those in a little more detail. One is the Accessory Dwelling Unit legislation, which was prompted by, this wasn't a new concept. There's been a law, I think, since 2002 or 2003 that required a ministerial process for local agencies to approve accessory dwelling units. The problem with the law was it was pretty unclear how it was implemented. So the provisions basically said if a local agency has an ordinance that complies with these standards that are set up in state law, they can use their local ordinance. But if their ordinance doesn't comply, you have to approve projects pursuant to this process in state law. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of confusion statewide about, well, does my ordinance fit? Does it not? And there was actually litigation in the city of Los Angeles where they approved a project pursuant to state law because they felt that their ordinance was not in compliance, and a neighbor sued and created a lot of uncertainty there. So these bills attempted to streamline that process further. They attempted to put a little more caps on how fees can be imposed on those units, while not really addressing the underlying issue, which is, of course, Proposition 13 in California has sort of restricted our ability to recoup infrastructure costs and other services needed for development through taxes. And so we have this structure of fees. We have Proposition 218, which ensures that ratepayers don't subsidize new development, rather new development, including small units like an accessory dwelling unit, pay for the cost, the marginal cost that they're putting on the infrastructure systems. Again, in a second area of law where there's an existing local requirement and the state felt that local governments weren't necessarily implementing it in good faith, we saw some successful legislation addressing the density bonus law. So it sought to really tamp down on the requests for information and studies that cities and counties could require of a developer who's attempting to use the density bonus. And the concept of density bonus, I assume most people in this room are familiar, but in exchange for providing some affordable units, the developer can get either a higher density project, which, as I understand it, hasn't really turned out to be the case. In fact, what developers usually use are the other provisions in the law, which allows them to extract concessions from the local government them in the press. This, housing was identified as this huge priority, and you have columnists saying, well, the state's sort of tinkering at the margins of things, but we haven't taken on CEQA, we haven't addressed the tax incentives that affect housing, we haven't even really, overridden local permitting processes that a lot of people are holding up as problematic. So the legislature reacted in 2017 with a massive vote of new legislation. So at the beginning of this session, which started in January, we had a lot of new members. These new members now don't term out until 2024, so there's a perspective that a lot of them might have a longer term view of a lot of issues. But they reacted to this perception of crisis by introducing 130 individual bills on housing. And so we're parsing through them, and the policy process is ongoing. But again, we can break them down into a few key categories. So there's funding proposals out there again, the permanent sources back, the real estate reporting fee minus documents recorded for the sale of homes is back. That's projected to generate about $300 million a year. But again, this isn't a revenue source we use right now, so we're not really sure what that might generate in practice. Senator Bell has introduced a $3 billion statewide housing bond. In November 2016, actually, in pretty unprecedented actions, there were some local countywide housing bonds approved in, I believe, Santa Clara County and Alameda County, and Los Angeles County passed a measure that supports homelessness housing. So the state's, again, trying to really repeat Prop 1C from 2006, which was regarded as a pretty successful program, but a program for which the funding is now run out. In response to the governor's veto of his tax credit bill last session, Assemblymember Chu has introduced a bill that would again allocate $300 million in general fund to state tax credits. And the governor vetoed it because cost pressures on the general fund. He didn't want this new ongoing obligation, especially not without a streamlining bill. So Assemblymember Chu's new bill proposes to offset that general fund cost by eliminating the mortgage interest deduction, the state mortgage interest deduction on second homes. We also have a couple of streamlining proposals. So I'd say that there's a few that are really based on an opt-in approach. So Assemblymember Chu has one that's like that. Senator Roth has one like that. And these programs basically try to get at the issue that the governor wanted in his streamlining bill, but in a voluntary way. So cities and counties, under both of these proposals, would essentially set up districts and do sort of a master plan level EIR to reviewing environmental impacts of development. And in exchange, they would give developments in those districts a ministerial review. So the idea is that you do more of the review up front rather than sort of attempting to sidestep it, as one might have criticized the governor's proposal. And both of these programs come with an incentive. And the incentives haven't been really well defined, but they're essentially, the state's going to give the local government money in exchange for taking this action, which is designed to expedite housing. And so the question, of course, is, are the incentives strong enough to get local governments to participate? And are all the other requirements that are going to be imposed on the developments that take advantage of this process too burdensome, or are they not a big deal for developers who might use it, right? So if those requirements are too costly and too extensive, is anyone even going to take advantage of it? We have another proposal that I think is sort of being portrayed in the media as kind of the main streamlining proposal, and this one is more of a mandatory process, and that's Senator Wiener's SB 35, which is really interesting because it takes a lot of the components of the governor's plan last year, attempts to address some of the criticism from organized labor groups and environmentalists, and it imposes a new criteria by which the process would be invoked. So for really the first time, I think, those regional housing needs allocation numbers would have a meaningful consequence. And so the concept of the bill is that if a local agency is not seeing housing production meet those regional housing needs allocation goals. And CSAC argues that those are planning goals. They're not a production quota for local agencies, especially when we're talking about low or very low income housing, for which it's pretty widely recognized there's just not enough subsidy statewide to go around and build the number of units we need to meet that. But if production wasn't meeting those levels, a by right process would be invoked for the second half of the 8-year planning period under which that happened, and eligible projects wouldn't have to go through the same discretionary process that they would otherwise have to. So a different take on the governor's plan. And there's a lot of negotiations going on, I know, with organized labor about what sort of concessions they would like to see developers who choose to use this by right process under SB 35. And so things that are on the table, I know, are discussions about prevailing wage, provisions about using a skilled and trained workforce, which is essentially a union workforce. We've got a couple of bills that are pretty similar to the successful versions of things from last year. So they're just taking existing requirements on local governments related to planning and trying to tweak those with the idea that if we just tighten down the housing element process a little bit more, suddenly we're going to see more production. So there are provisions related to no net loss of sites for affordable housing across the 8-year planning period for urban areas. And the idea there would be that if you have a site that's been identified for low or very low income housing, and a market rate development gets built on that site during your planning horizon, you'd have to make sure that there was still an adequate supply of sites to accommodate your share of the low and very low income housing. That bill is SB 166 by Senator Skinner. There's another bill with the same sponsors, Western Center on Law and Poverty, that would impose additional criteria on the sites that you can designate for affordable housing in your housing element. And they're trying to put limitations related to infrastructure availability, which is something, especially from a county perspective, where we usually aren't the infrastructure provider for water and sewer and some of these basic services. They would make it more difficult and add more analysis before you can add a site that isn't currently served by that sort of infrastructure. They're also attempting to put upper and lower boundaries on the size of parcels that can be identified as affordable, with the idea that there are some jurisdictions out there that are saying, okay, we have this 20-acre parcel, we have a regional housing needs allocation for low or very low of, let's say 500 units, and we're going to do one project on one parcel, and that's how we're going to accommodate our need. And they're saying that that's not an adequate way to address that planning obligation, and they feel that HCD doesn't currently have authority to kick sites like that off the list. The last major area of bills that's been introduced this year, I'm calling it enforcement in quotes because I think as the representative of local government at the legislative level here, we are always pushing back against what are our planning obligations versus our production obligations. But there's several bills related to the Housing Accountability Act, which, as you all know, makes it pretty difficult to deny projects, housing projects that meet zoning without making specified findings. So there's an effort to further tighten the Housing Accountability Act. Some of the earlier versions of the bills were actually going, from our perspective, going after our ability to impose conditions on those projects. There's a lot of bills focused around the regional housing needs allocation compliance, which in general, CSAC's perspective on that is it's conflating production with our obligation to plan. There's legislation that would attempt to enshrine the current requirement under federal regulations for an agency that receives funding from HUD to affirmatively further fair housing, which we're worried could be a pretty open-ended new opportunity for lawsuits against local plans, especially because it talks specifically about actions or even inactions by a local agency to affirmatively further fair housing. And then there's some bills that would give HCD a little bit more authority to determine if a local agency is in compliance with all of its housing element related requirements, and giving the Attorney General some money to help enforce those laws. So where do we stand right now? The major funding bills are approaching votes on the floors of their respective houses. As everyone knows, in California, to pass a new tax and raise revenue, you have to get a 2/3 vote. And so we did just have 2/3 votes in both houses to raise transportation funding. So the question now is, when we're looking at cap and trade, which might also require a 2/3 vote to be reauthorized, is there going to be the political appetite for some of those, and it would probably mostly be Democrats who are in tough districts, to take another tax vote this year? The governor didn't include any major proposals in his budget this year, but he did reiterate his desire that if he's going to sign any bill that raises new funding for affordable housing, he wants to see streamlining go concurrently. And as I mentioned sort of throughout the talk today, there's a lot of interest groups that are lobbying for specific carve-outs or criteria in streamlining bills, so attempting to secure concessions that are favorable for their groups. So the deadline for floor votes is coming up in June, so we're going to have a pretty good idea then of what's still alive in the second house. And I think given the difficulty some of those funding bills are going to have in getting that 2/3 vote, and the fact that a lot of these interest groups that are participating in the debate really aren't interested in streamlining unless it's accompanied by funding, we might have a pretty interesting second house strategy. So that's all I've got. I know that's quite a lot. Hard to parse through all the proposals that are out there, but if you go to CSAC's website, which is counties.org, there's links on there under legislation where you can look at all the housing bills that we're tracking, and my email's up there. But happy to turn it over to the other panelists, and hopefully that was a good summary of the political environment that we're facing as we talk about some of these local actions.
All right. Thanks, Chris. We're going to now hand over to Alan Bell from County of Santa Barbara. You can use the podium.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. As Chris mentioned, the state legislature has been busy. I'm going to focus in on one particular aspect of that today. And in particular, he mentioned some of the new laws that have made it easier and cheaper for property owners to construct accessory dwelling units. And these laws have had some immediate impacts. For example, they've spurred new construction. They've also generated a lot of heated debate, both pro and con in terms of the legislation. So I'm going to go out and really kind of cover a couple of topics here today. One is I'm going to talk about the status of some of the new laws that were passed. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the county's efforts to adopt AUD ordinances. Thirdly, I'd like to just touch upon some of the questions we've been receiving about the relationship between AUDs, the county's recently updated housing element, and our regional housing need application. And then lastly, I'll just touch upon some local reactions to some of the state planning, essentially the state legislations that has come down with mandates and has really been kind of the top-down planning approach. So last year we saw several bills go through that directed basically local governments to review their ordinances and to actually adopt ordinances that would remove barriers to constructing accessory dwelling units. The real point here was that many legislators felt that the existing ordinances really propose a barrier to construction, and they want to remove some of those barriers to facilitate construction of accessory dwelling units. So these new laws are actually mandates. They're not optional. Local ordinances that are not in compliance with those provisions of the new law are null and void. And the county is looking at, as I'll mention in a few minutes, working on that particular topic, but also the legislature wasn't waiting for local governments to take action. What they did is they said that outside the coastal zone, those new laws went into effect on January 1st. Within the coastal zone, the laws will not go into effect until a local government submits and the coastal commission certifies a local AUD ordinance. So the county has begun preparing ordinances for implementation of the new state laws. In the interim period, we are continuing to review applications for accessory dwelling units. And what that means is in areas outside the coastal zone, we're applying state law to review those proposals. Within the coastal zone, the county is continuing to review applications according to existing regulations within its coastal zoning ordinance. So to date, we haven't seen a real groundswell, but since January 1st, the county has approved 3 AUDs, and we have 6 applications that are currently in process, and under the state provisions, those have to be processed within 120 days of their receipt. They also have to be processed through a ministerial process. So as a first step in moving forward with the county ordinances, county planners prepared and presented a draft AUD ordinance for Montecito to the Montecito Planning Commission. The Montecito Planning Commission conducted 3 hearings, which concluded just 2 days ago, and made recommendations that are going to have some fairly sweeping changes, and I'll go over those in a little bit more detail in just a moment. The County Planning Commission is scheduled to review AUD ordinances for the balance of the county and the coastal zone beginning on June 7th, and then we'll move forward to the Board of Supervisors shortly thereafter this summer. Again, the intent of some of these bills was really to reflect the fact that many legislators feel that local ordinances impose unreasonable barriers on accessory dwelling units. And what I thought would be helpful, just to give you a sense of what was in place in Montecito and what the new provisions are actually showing. And this slide just highlights a few of the key provisions that are in effect in Montecito, or were in effect up until January 1st. So, for example, to have a detached accessory unit, we were required to have a lot of 5 acres or larger. To develop an attached accessory unit, there was a size limit of 1,000 square feet. If you proposed a project with an accessory dwelling unit or had existing development where you were proposing an accessory dwelling unit, there were special lot coverage provisions that would apply and actually restrict development on that parcel more so than otherwise. And the restrictions were basically to limit lot coverage for the AUD and the existing development to 40% of the lot. And then they also had parking requirements of 1 parking space per bedroom for the AUD. Now what's happened as a result of the state law and what we've seen through the county Montecito Planning Commission's recommendations earlier this week, there's some pretty sweeping changes that are going to allow considerable new opportunities for ADUs in Montecito on lots that just previously weren't eligible for that type of development. So a couple of the key highlights here are: 1, the minimum lot size requirements are gone. 5-acre provisions no longer exist. There are going to be new opportunities for detached AUDs that are constructed within existing detached structures. So you could take an existing cabana and convert it to an accessory dwelling unit. In those cases, the changes again are really sweeping in that the size limits go up to 1,200 square feet. The permitting requirements are essentially, for the most part, eliminated. They're very streamlined, and More importantly, is when the county issues a permit, that permit will not be appealable. The parking requirements are eliminated on those types of circumstances. And then notably, the Montecito Planning Commission did retain some provisions that they felt were consistent with the new law. And for example, they maintained the lot coverage requirement of 40%. They also retained the parking requirements. And really the sense there is that they're trying to protect the existing character of Montecito, which is characterized typically as kind of a semi-rural residential character. So what we've seen is new state laws coming into effect. We've also seen that the county recently adopted an updated housing element, which goes from 2015 to 2023 to comply with our 8-year housing cycle. And now what we're getting is a lot of questions about the relationship between the new state laws and our housing element, and importantly, our RENA. So when we look at that, it's important to kind of look at two aspects of the questions we're receiving. What is the immediate effect on our current housing element, and what's the future effect on our next round of housing, will be the update that occurs in about 6 years. So with each housing element cycle, most of you know that communities receive a regional housing needs allocation. So in the current cycle, the county received, as shown on this slide, an allocation of 661 units divided among the different income categories. As part of our inventory work, we conducted a land inventory, which showed that we had land far in excess to meet those allocations. And that's shown basically here that we had over 5,100 units that could be accommodated under current zoning and other provisions that would allow for redevelopment of sites. As part of that land inventory, we did take a look and made a link to accessory dwelling units. What we did is we looked at the past trends for development of accessory dwelling units within the county and then applied that toward part of our RENA. The result was that we factored in about 57 accessory dwelling units over the entire housing cycle. So not a lot of units compared to the numbers that we saw on the previous slide, but nonetheless, they are factored in, and many of those may factor in at low income or above. So to put the current perspective into place, basically, the county had a RENA. We've shown that we have sufficient and adequate sites to accommodate that RENA. We have the new legislation that's coming in. So we know that we have a housing element that's been deemed in full compliance with state law. We also foresee that there's going to be increased development of accessory dwelling units as a result of new laws. The real impact of this current housing cycle is not really going to be significant or really have any effect on our RENA currently or our housing element, simply because we've already satisfied our housing allocation needs, and while we may have an uptick in the number of accessory dwelling units, that doesn't really affect the housing element or our RENA in any way, but it does provide an affordable, oftentimes component of new housing that's greatly needed within the county's unincorporated areas. So as we look forward to the next housing cycle, which will begin in about 6 years or so, what we will also look at is the new RENA that the county will receive. And the new RENA can be addressed under state law using a number of different strategies. And there is a government code that again allows local governments to count future future accessory dwelling units as part of their RENA. So I think really what we're going to be seeing here is the effect of the new law and how it increases, or whether and to what degree it increases the number of accessory dwelling units that are constructed. We're presuming that that number is going to go up significantly, and that therefore, rather than counting just 7 units in the next housing element cycle, we'd be able to count many, many more housing units as accessory dwelling units toward meeting a portion of our RENA. So the last thing I'd like to comment is, I think through Chris's presentation, really, takes local government control away and also intends to set new provisions for establishing and constructing housing. And there's a lot of debate about the pros and the cons to that. From a perspective of what we've seen so far in the county with the accessory dwelling units, both the Montecito Planning Commission and the County Planning Commission have expressed a lot of concern about this change and the way the legislation comes through and gives them very little latitude in planning communities. One planning commissioner was quoted as saying in a public hearing that really this new ADU ordinance that's going to be coming through and the state law that accompanied it, of course, really has the potential to change the residential zones as we've seen them in the past. But some of the primary concerns that they've been focusing on are some of the costs to adopt and implement these new state laws, which in the case of ADUs, there's no reimbursement from the state to local governments for preparing and implementing ordinances. There's also, of course, just the overall loss of local control, and then there's the effects of the new development, which really include things like increases in density, we have increases in on-street parking, and then effects on community character itself. So I think what we'll be watching closely is really what the trends are within the county, both incorporated and unincorporated areas, but I think it's undeniable that these types of dwelling units have a great ability to meet a portion of the housing needs within a relatively short period through private development. Thank you very much.
I left a little booby trap there for Alan. Next up is Renee Brooke from the city of Santa Barbara. And we're going to dive right in here. Renee, I don't know if you want to come up here.
Thank you all for your interest in this session. I'm going to start off my presentation very brief. Continuing with the theme of accessory dwelling units, as Alan just finished with, and then I really want to spend most of my time talking about the city's average unit size density incentive program. But there we go. So the first part of this session, as it's called, Making Housing a Priority Act, or REACT. The first part is REACT. So we're reacting to the state legislation regarding accessory dwelling units. And the points I want to highlight here for the city, because we don't yet have a local ordinance, so we are processing permits as we receive them under the state law. Just for a bit of history though, we have had what we've called in the city a secondary dwelling unit ordinance in effect since the early 90s. And under that ordinance, we've only permitted 16, here I'm calling them ADUs, but 16 of those since 1993. Up until 2003, as Chris mentioned, the city had required a conditional use permit for those. So that obviously was going to add a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to try to permit some of these. But even then, we've still only seen 16 in that time period. Our housing element that we recently adopted in 2015 does have an implementation strategy to adopt a more flexible program for permitting more secondary dwelling units or accessory dwelling units. So we did already have that vision in our housing element to make those easier. And then came the state law and said, well, that was all very nice, but here you go, we're going to make them super easy. So since that legislation has passed, we have already received 63 permit applications. So in a city that averages about 80 to 100 net new dwelling units a year, this is a significant addition to our housing stock potentially. So as I mentioned, we don't yet have a local ordinance in the city. We are just on the brink of beginning that process to draft an ordinance and then go out through public outreach and hearings on that. We do anticipate, based on some standards that we have in our existing secondary dwelling unit, to have some standards that would address some of these topics as they would be allowed in the state legislation. So there are parameters. Right now, we're implementing the state law. It does have parameters for when a local jurisdiction adopts regulations. You can do so within certain parameters. And so we believe, based on the the community's history with acceptance of these units in certain areas and not in others, that we would want to have some provisions potentially prohibiting them in high fire hazard areas, and then protecting designated historic structures where we can. There is a provision that a finding would need to be made, although these are ministerial, that you not have an impact on a designated historic structure. Also, maximum unit size in the state law right now, the maximum is 1,200 square feet. That's fairly large, so we believe we would probably have a smaller unit size than that. So then transitioning to our average unit size density incentive program, and this has been really fun lately, talking about AUDs and ADUs, and everybody's, which one are we talking about today? This is a combination of acting and reacting when the city began to develop this program. And it started really in 2005, when we embarked on our general plan update in 2005. We went out and did a lot of community outreach, got community input and preferences for how this general plan that has a life of 20 years, what are the important components to the community? And overwhelmingly, we were told we need to continue to limit non-residential growth, we need to protect historic resources, and we need to incentivize more affordable and rental housing. So also keep in mind that at the beginning of this effort, we still had a redevelopment agency. So, and we thought we would have it for at least 10 more years, because ours was set to sunset, I believe it was in 2015 anyway, before the state law passed that expired it before that. So we were really focused on incentivizing developers, private developers, to develop market rate housing that was more affordable than what we had been seeing leading up to 2005. So, and what we had seen during that time period was what we had in place at the time was called variable density standards. It assessed allowed density on the site based on the number of bedrooms in a unit. So we were seeing very large units with small number of bedrooms, and at that time, they were almost overwhelmingly condominiums. Not a lot of rental housing. If we did see it, it was in the range of like 1 to 2 units here and there, but not large apartment developments. It's important, I think, to note, it's really important, I think, to go back to understanding why we developed the average unit size density program, and it's often forgot because we really started that in 2009. And now that we're seeing some of these projects proposed, approved, and under construction, it appears to many that perhaps we pulled this out of thin air just last year. But there really was a lot of thought that went into it, and was somewhat reacting to the type of development we had seen in the 2000s, where the median unit size was almost 1,500 square feet. They were primarily condominiums, mostly providing 2 parking spaces, because we were told by developers that's just what the market demanded when you have a for sale unit product. And we were seeing an average density of these projects of 18 units to the acre. So in 2011, with regard to housing, the general plan vision was to allow as much housing as possible within resource limits to provide an array of lifestyle options for a demographically and economically diverse population. So as I mentioned, in order to do that, we needed to incentivize the private market to develop smaller rental units. So beginning in 2009, going through a charrette process, a lot of economic studies, feasibility studies to determine what components should go into this program in order to incentivize this, to produce the type of housing we needed to still get an economic return for the developers so that they would propose these projects. We ended up coming up with a sliding scale where if you have, on average, smaller unit sizes in the development proposal, you could have more density. So that's why it's called the average unit size density program. We knew we needed to target multifamily and commercial zones. We wanted higher densities in these areas. The average unit size component of this program was going to encourage smaller unit sizes, we hoped. and would also reach higher densities. And we need to locate these closer to transit and services. And this also goes without saying maybe, but bedroom count doesn't matter here. It's all about unit size, and it's all about what we had hoped was we may take the same type of development box that we were seeing in the 2000s, but we could get many more units in that same development. So in order to have, what we ended up getting was unanimous approval by City Council of our general plan in 2011, there was some compromise. And so this program is a trial program. It has a lifetime of either 8 years or until 250 units are constructed in the highest density, the priority housing overlay areas, which I'll show in a moment. And that was a compromise. And we're monitoring this through our adaptive management program. So the ordinance itself was adopted in 2013. So we're getting about 3.5 years into the program right now. So here's a map of the AUD program and where it's allowed. It's all of our multifamily and commercial zone districts for the most part. So these lighter colors are the medium-high density residential areas with a maximum density of 15 to 27 dwelling units per acre. That's the same as it was prior to adoption of AUD. So the same densities are allowed here as they were prior to AUD. But where the high density areas are is downtown, the darker version of these colors out here at La Cumbra. And the priority housing overlay, which maximizes density up to 63 dwelling units per acre if you are one of 3 types of project: rental housing, employer sponsored, or limited equity co-op. You can go up to 63 dwelling units per acre. And that, because there's that restriction, you have to be one of those 3 types of projects. That's why we're seeing so many rental projects in the priority housing overlay, where otherwise, if it wasn't rental, if it was ownership in this area, the maximum density allowed would be 36 dwelling units per acre. So developers are taking advantage, as we wanted them to provide rental housing at these higher densities. So as I mentioned, some of the incentives provided by the program are the increased densities, reduced parking requirements outside the central business district, and the central business district is essentially, well, the map's not, but it's downtown up to about Sola, down to the freeway. Before adoption of the AUD, mixed-use developments in the central business district only had to provide 1 parking space per dwelling unit. So the average unit size density program requires only 1 parking space per unit, regardless of where it's located. So that's quite an incentive. It also allows variable setbacks and some flexibility where open yard is provided. So this map, it's a little washed out here, but this map is on our website, our AUD program website. It shows here where the projects have been proposed under this program. So focusing downtown, the blue markers are those that are located in the priority housing overlay. So they're mostly developing at that higher density, upwards towards 63 dwelling units per acre. Again, along transit corridors downtown where there's services, where there's transit. The red is the high density or medium high, and then there's some priority out here at near the Cumbra. So the current status of the AUD program, as I mentioned, it has an initial trial period of 8 years or until 250 units are constructed in that highest density area downtown, the Cumbra Plaza area. So my division is monitoring this daily in field. So where are we in 3.5 years of this program? So I'm providing here stats for all categories of housing that we've seen, but we're really focusing on in the red text there, because those are the units that count towards that 250 unit test, and it has to be constructed and occupied units. We have right now 89 that are occupied, that's the mark out on Upper State Street. They have a temporary C of O, so we do have 89 units counting towards that 250 at this point. Another 62 that are under construction, 215 units that have been approved, and 450 pending. So what happens at the end of this period, because it is a trial period, is if nothing else has changed in the ordinance, when we have this 250th magical unit produced and occupied, the program would automatically revert back to variable density, which is not a density program that we believe we really want to go back to. So we are already beginning to discuss some changes to the program. Also, it's worth mentioning, there's about 5 or 6 projects that if they continue forward at a pace to get building permits and complete construction, it would probably be about 5 or 6 projects that would end up making up that 250 unit cap. And we believe that we would reach that in about 18 to 24 months, barring any unforeseen changes in construction, financing, or materials. And well before the 8-year period of the program. So I mentioned there's already discussion about adjustments to the program. There are concerns that the program is too successful. We didn't anticipate all of these projects and all of this interest in the program, and it does have many people in the community concerned about the pace at which we're seeing these projects proposed, approved, and developed. Also, because the program is written such that any project that's deemed complete prior to that 250th unit being occupied may continue through the process and use these incentives. As I showed in that prior slide, we already have 816 units that could potentially be built. So there's concern that there may be too many units built under this program that we weren't anticipating. That when decision makers made the compromise thinking that they might see 250 of these units and then we would reassess the program. So that's causing a bit of concern and fear it's too successful. Also, there is some unknown answers at this point of whether or not these housing units are affordable to our workforce. Also concerns about potential parking impacts with only requiring 1 space per unit. And then asking the question, who's going to live in these units? The goal was to house our existing employees and existing residents, that people might move around in the housing market, free up other housing for other people, that we could get people off this, not commuting to Ventura or elsewhere from Ventura. So, quickly wrapping up, we have a housing task force that was formed by City Council in December. The task force is made up of 3 council members, 3 planning commissioners, and a housing authority commissioner. And they're studying those various aspects of the program that I just mentioned that has caused some concern and may need some adjustment. They have met, I believe, 3 times. They meet next week. If you're interested in following their discussion, there is a web page on the city's website. Just look under board and commissions under housing task force. Public meetings at 630 Garden Street. One other thing to mention, City Council has also considered a potential growth management component to the ordinance. And again, to get at that fear that perhaps the program is too successful, should we meter out these units and how they're developed over a period of time. So we have not yet gone back to council with that proposal, but that's something that we're working on right now. So I'm going to wrap that up because I know you wanted to leave a lot for questions.
Thank you, Renee. We are going to do some Q&A here for our panel, and just give us a second to get the wireless mics going, and we will dive right in here. Hollow is going to help. Is it 2 and 3, correct?
2, 3.
2 and 3? Right. Good with 2 and 3? 2, this is 2, all right.
do have to record a covenant on the land, that those units remain as rental units for the life of however long, for so long as the project is developed at that density. So they are,
The rental units for residents of Santa Barbara County, or?
no, there's no criteria or requirement for who lives in the units. But that is something that has been brought up as something we should explore, if we can.
So if I live in San Luis Obispo, I could rent a unit as a second home if I wanted to.
You could.
Okay. I actually have one more question. Okay. I wanted to ask, Chris, with the legislation that's been attempted to be passed year after year related to the recording fees, knowing the association, California Association of Realtors as opposed to it in terms of being applied to any recorded documents for purchase transactions, do you think, why do you think that continues to, like, who's the biggest opponent of that in the form that it's been proposed without the purchase recorded documents? Who's the biggest opponent of that, and why do you think it consistently fails? Because it's been 3, 4, 5 years now that they've been attempting to pass that.
Right, and there was, before Assemblyman Barakis took it up, there was a proposal from Senator Desaulnier from the Bay Area. So I think we were on like maybe the 4th iteration of the bill. And I would say, I think now that the realtors have removed their opposition, actually our county clerk reporters don't like it. They're not a huge, obviously, political constituency, but they have some concerns with it. But I really think the difficulty for that proposal is just general squeamishness about raising taxes. And given the supermajority vote requirement, it doesn't take a lot of members to not want to go up on it for it to not pass.
Okay, so just to expand on that, I guess my more direct question is, do you think, are there people who feel, so the association has removed its opposition, but that's because they're not directly affected by it in that the most recently proposed legislation didn't include recorded documents for purchase transactions, right? So,
Correct.
so it's not affecting them as much, so they've removed opposition, but are those then who are still proponents of it or even opposed to it concerned that those are excluded from the legislation? And do you think that's part of the reason it's not successful in passing, or just generally that it's a tax?
I think it's more the general tax issue, but I think there's certainly a policy argument to be made that it should apply more broadly.
Question for Renee. Renee, I know we have a task force looking at the AUD. Are there other jurisdictions in the state of California that have AUD ordinances? And if there are, what have we learned from them and their experience?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure, honestly, if there are other jurisdictions that have a similar program.
I was going to ask Renee this about the accessory units. You said they will not be allowed in the high fire hazard parts of the city. I was wondering why you would stop that, or perhaps put a limit instead on the number of individuals that can occupy that site. I mean, you can have a house up there with a family of 4 or 5 kids, and they've got several cars, and they're spilling out of the unit, and then you can have an older couple or individual who has the space for an accessory unit within their building that they're not using. So why would that make more of a problem to get those people out of a high fire?
Right, I mentioned it as something that we likely would propose. It is historically, it has been in our ordinance to restrict them, prohibit them in high fire hazard areas. Our housing element, our policy guides us to continue that restriction, but it would be, it's up for discussion when the ordinance is out and for review and public hearing, if there's alternate ways to try to address the concern of increasing density in high fire hazard areas.
Chris, I have a question for Chris on
governments to require the construction of a proportion of affordable units for rental projects. And a concession that was taken to get some major opposition off of that bill was that local agencies would have to provide an alternate means of complying with it. So, which I think in practice wasn't a particularly large concession, because I think most agencies that have historically used this did offer an alternative compliance method, such as a payment of an in lieu fee instead of building the units on site. But the sponsors of that bill, and we work with them on several issues, so Western Center and California Rural Legal Assistance and others, I think we're most concerned about getting it off the assembly floor. So I think they're pretty confident about the bill's chances in the Senate.
I have a question for Renee. Given the level of misinformation about the AUD that at least I find in the community, is it possible that the kind of presentation you have given here could be made more widely available, something in the form of the process that led up to the general plan update, where the community was involved and knew what was going on? Is there some way to make them know what is going on at this point?
Mickey, I'm happy to do that if there's a proper forum suggestion for what that forum might be. I've certainly had the discussion and presentation at many city council meetings and many other meetings like this, APA conferences. If there's another mechanism to try to get the word out broader, I'm happy to do it if people have suggestions for what that forum might be. KUIT made an attempt.
My question's for Renee, and I wanted to know if any employee-sponsored housing or limited equity cooperatives have made use of the AUD program, and if not, what incentives could be provided to try to stimulate the more development using those provisions?
Sure, that's a great question. That is an aspect that the Housing Task Force will look at as they work their way down the priorities, how to try to encourage more of that, reaching out to employers to provide that. There is one project, I believe it just went to the Planning Commission yesterday, Westmont Housing Development near Cottage Hospital. It's 10 or so units. 13 units, and I have 5 planning commissioners in here. So that's one. It was an older approved project. I believe it was under a condo map, and then they revamped it using ADU, AUD to get more units on it. So that's one recent, but that's the only one so far that's employer sponsored.
I just want to say I admire everyone out there trying to keep AUD and ADU here. It's very confusing.
Renee, I'm sorry. Renee. So congratulations on your success. I'm going to put you on the spot. How does staff feel about having implemented this successful program, which is obviously getting to the heart of issues, and being in a position where you have to write a growth management ordinance to restrict or limit the number of units that are being built?
That's a great question. My objective every time I discuss this program or any program that the city's implementing is to deal with facts. There's a lot of emotion about the program. There's a lot of speculation. I try to just remind people why the program was developed, as I did here today, and also remind people it's not the only program to help solve our housing crisis. It is one component. We do still need subsidized affordable housing. AUD has definitely been a stimulus for private market rate rental housing development, which we haven't seen in 40 years. And so, as a planner, someone who looks out 20 years, I might have more patience or willingness to see where propose that's challenging though for people who are concerned about changes in their neighborhoods, potential impacts to historic resources. So, but I just always try to speak in facts. This had a long history of being developed. There's reasons why these incentives were provided, and yes, we knew that we would probably have to adjust this program. It's built into the general plan. But let's just talk about facts.
Renee, I guess I have the microphone so I get to speak. Quick question. While I'm supportive of AUD, I'm very worried about seeing some applications that some of the units be converted to vacation rentals already. Why can't we have the planning staff, the planning commission take a strong position and just say that's not going to happen?
I know there's more of a legal answer here, so I can't provide that as well as our city attorney could, in terms of what we can and can't do to require people to maintain housing as rental housing. We do already have regulations on the books that allow short-term rentals only in certain areas. So they're not allowed everywhere. They wouldn't be allowed, let's say, in the R3 zone where some of the AD projects are proposed. But that could be something that we explore, another type of a restriction if we can.
Well, as a planner, could you recommend it against it with a clear conscience because we created AUD to create rental housing versus vacation rentals? So hopefully we could ask the staff to recommend against any conversions on AUD.
Right, and it is prohibited in the priority housing overlay if a project is developed at that highest density. As I mentioned, there's a covenant that it remain in long-term rental status for as long as it's built at that density. So we do have that built in for that highest density sector of the AUD. So what we're lacking is the high density and medium high restriction.
Hi, I want to speak a little bit to the transportation, I guess, factor with the AUD program. So with lower parking requirements, requiring only one parking space per unit, my understanding is that the goal is that as people move into AUD units, they're shifting to other modes like biking, walking, and taking transit. So in regards to the housing task force, currently, are they looking at tools that can strengthen, incentivize, or even fund further investments so that way those modes do continue to grow and we don't just see sort of that worst case scenario of like increased traffic and parking demand? And yeah, so I'd be curious what tools you guys are looking at within the task force or the existing AUD program.
That's a very timely question. It's almost like you're planted in the audience because that's the very topic that the Housing Task Force is going to discuss next Wednesday. And as I mentioned, if you go to our website, find the Housing Task Force under boards and commissions, there's already out an agenda packet for next week's meeting. And it is about other ways to potentially target these projects, other considerations to explore. Runs the whole gamut of potentially more parking in certain areas of town, potentially less parking in other areas of town, unbundling parking, having an in-lieu parking fee. So I recommend, if you're interested in that, to read that and potentially go to the task force meeting.
Thank you. And I would just add that the reason I asked that is because the city of Santa Barbara recently adopted the new bicycle master plan, but unfortunately, most of those projects are dependent on outside grant funding sources to be implemented. And I feel that a key way to incentivize people switching over to cycling would be funding those bicycle master plan projects so that way they have safe and comfortable bikeways to choose to do so.
Any other questions? We have time for maybe one more song? But, okay, one more and then we'll go.
Raise your hand.
question about whether this task force and the staff is going to be evaluating the economic component of this ordinance, because it seems that would have been something that you could have predicted at the beginning. When you allow higher density, you're automatically increasing the value of the land. And then if you don't ask for some kind of public accommodation in terms of who you want to target, you're going to get developers, being the private sector entrepreneurs that they are, building for the high end of the market. So I think looking at the economics might be good. Is there a plan for that?
There is. I believe it was 1 or 2 meetings ago, the Housing Task Force directed staff to prepare 2 studies. One is a nexus study to determine whether or not the development of this market rate, even at the higher end of the workforce housing sector, does it have an effect on the provision of affordable housing or the increased demand for affordable housing? And then also an economic feasibility study to determine if we were to have some type of affordability requirement, whether it's inclusionary, if we're allowed to do that, or an in lieu fee or some other mechanism to generate affordable housing to the moderate income range, what does that do to the overall feasibility of these projects? Also taking into account other parts of the incentive package, like the 1 parking space per unit. So we don't have the results of the studies. We're just going out to contract with consultants for those. But we hope to have the results in about 6 months or so.
I was more just thinking of workforce, since this is a workforce conference, the 120 to the 200%, rather than affordable. I thought that's what this ordinance was originally
Correct.
designed for.
Correct. The AUD program is targeting the 120 to 200%.
All right, well, it's lunchtime. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris, Alan, and Renee. We would appreciate it if you would grab an umbrella